Could you imagine inheriting a 150-year-old $2 billion media company at the age of 26? I couldn't. Then, along with managing this media behemoth, losing the company completely over the next few years. Our guest today lived through that. That's right. Not too long out of graduate school, Warwick Fairfax inherited Fairfax Media, one of the top media companies in Australia, worth $2.25 billion, and then began the painful process of watching his family's company slip away one day at a time until it was all gone. Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Business Method Podcast. Today, we have a very unique story to tell you. In the intro, you learned a bit about Warwick Fairfax, and we will get to hear the exact story of what it was like for him as a young man losing his family's company. But there's more. We'll also hear how he turned his entire life around after that experience and where he's ended up today as a businessman, Wall Street Journal bestselling author, consultant, and entrepreneur. It's going to be an exciting show, so let's jump into it. Warwick, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
I'm very good, and thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time. I think, we've got a little over an hour to chat, so I would just like to dive into the history of Fairfax, because not only is it fascinating, your experience that you went through, and then you were also able to bounce back after that and become a successful individual. But coming from a place as a child growing up in the family business, and then expecting your entire life to take over that business and that being your life path, and then everything having to change. But then the history of this family business is over 150 years old, which is fascinating. So could you take us back to, what was it, 1841 when this company started?
Yeah, exactly, Chris. So, I know a lot of folks in your audience are business owners, executives, and there was sort of a microcosm of some lessons we can learn from the founder of the family business, John Fairfax. His success was really sown in the seeds of tragedy, funnily enough. So he was in England in 1830s or so. He was a newspaper man. He founded a business in a little town, Leamington Spa, in the county of Warwick in England. And he was doing pretty well. And he wrote an article about a local lawyer. And the lawyer sued him for defamation twice, but the judge ruled in John Fairfax's favor, saying the story was accurate about this unscrupulous lawyer. Mm-hmm. But back then, you had to pay your own court costs. So even though he was vindicated, he was bankrupted, by this lawyer. So at that point, he said, forget this, and moved his family in the 5-6 month journey it took by sailing ship to Australia.
Yeah.
He ended up buying the Sydney Morning Herald with the partner, and that grew to be a very large business. So it's a case of, he could have said at that point, why bother founding a business? That these unscrupulous people will stab you in the back. Life's not fair. Even when you win, you lose.
Right.
That's ridiculous. The judge says you win, but he loses anyway.
Right.
So anyway, this company grew to be a very large family business. It had newspapers, magazines, newsprint mills, TV, radio stations. It had the Australian equivalent of the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post. 700 million odd in revenue, 4,000 employees. It was a massive company.
Wow.
So I was the fifth generation, the great-great-grandson of the founder, John Fairfax. So growing up, it was a little bit like growing up in the royal family. So to not go into the family business would be a bit like Prince William saying to his dad and grandmother, I'm just not feeling the whole royalty bit. And look what's going to happen to Prince Harry. It's not easy to get out. Right. The British public don't like it, frankly. So, I've never been in the military, but it was this sense of duty on a country. We weren't just making widgets. We were producing quality media to help the nation of Australia.
Yeah.
We weren't like media magnets that just kind of pay for play. Hey, you want a good story? That's great. there are other media barons that have this philosophy is, oh, the prime minister's a mate of mine. So
Yeah.
therefore we'll have good press and, we'll all be good. He'll do stuff for me, I'll do stuff for him. And we were never like that. It's, we would encourage our journalists to be independent, and you couldn't, quote unquote, buy the Fairfax media. We would, rightly or wrongly, in terms of our editorial and art and newspaper columns, we would always try to, if people need to be exposed, they would be exposed, politically or otherwise. So that was, so my whole life leading up to the $2.25 billion takeover in '87, some kids of wealthy family businesses, as folks will know from media or even Hollywood, they drive Ferraris, they do drugs, substance abuse. That's a common narrative,
Right.
In movies and in life. That was not me. I was, quote unquote, the good son, not the prodigal son. I kind of worked hard, took life seriously, got my undergrad at Oxford, like my dad and some other relatives, worked on Wall Street, got my MBA at Harvard Business School. So, I just felt like this was a sacred cause, and that just increased expectations exponentially because I worked hard, tried to be humble. So basically in the lead up to the major event, what precipitated it was my dad died in early '87. He was a lot older than me. I was from marriage number 3. He was in his 80s. There was a sense that, from him anyway, my parents, he was no longer in control, so to speak, that the company wasn't being well managed, wasn't being run along the ideals of the founder. Company was 50% held by the family, the rest publicly held. The public share price of the company rocketed up. It's the '80s. People felt like the company was in play. So I felt like I needed to do something to preempt any hostile takeover and bring the company back to the ideals of the founder, have it be well managed. So we launched this big takeover. So whether that was a good idea or not is obviously another question we'll get into. But I was this young, naive, idealistic crusader. Terrible things can happen out of youth, naivety, and a crusader mentality, and it did for me. So that's kind of the backstory leading up to the big event, I guess.
Now, you mentioned this, but I want to put it in context again for the listeners. So Fairfax Media was influential in the history of Australia, because in the early mid 1800s, that's when Australia, like America, was really being established and starting to be governed and structured, right? And then you have Fairfax Media, which is equivalent to Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. So like politicians were paying attention to what you guys were saying, because if you, like, Fairfax literally had the power to influence a person's career politically. And so that is a significant organization. Not only is it a $2 billion company, and you guys had like newspapers, television stations, and radio stations, like all in a conglomerate, correct? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so this was a bit of a pillar for the history of Australia, throughout those times. And then here you are, 26-year-old guy, out of grad school, well educated, your dad brought you up in this environment. You're like, I'm going to take this over. But I thought something was interesting. Back in 1930, was it your grandfather that took the company over when he was 28? Is that correct?
Yeah. So what happened is actually with my dad was, he'd finished college at Oxford, and his dad died of a heart attack. In fact, I think on the golf course between the 17th and 18th tee, funnily enough. And so my dad at about my age, give or take, I forget, maybe 27, somewhere around there, he ended up basically being in control. He was considered the heir, and pretty soon after became managing director. So at about a similar age to me, he was in a position where he was the leading figure in the company, which he was for, 40 plus years after that. So yeah, that's an interesting, he didn't need to take it over, but he was in that leading position pretty much close to the same age as I was. So that is an interesting coincidence, actually.
Yeah. So it wasn't like the first time it had happened, and so they probably had some confidence that, oh, it's been done once before, you know, work will be all right.
Well, yeah.
Let's send it. Let's have them
Well, I
try it
mean, the
out.
thing is, yeah, I mean, in my case, the rest of my family considered a hostile takeover back then. He was just
Hmm.
inheriting it. But yeah, I mean, if I'd done things differently, uh, they might have, and if somehow I didn't take it over and somehow it was in leading position at that age, depending on how I handle it, since I worked hard, yes, there was a precedent for somebody young being in a leading role, but the way I did it, it just angered the other large share, blocks of shares who were controlled by the family. They didn't want to be in a family business controlled by a 26-year-old where I'd have all the decisions, and so
Hmm.
they sold out. And October '87 stock market crash happened, which hurt our asset sales. So by the end of '87, we had an unsustainable level of debt. I did bring in new management that increased operating profits 80% the first year. I
Hmm.
suppose validating my thesis that it wasn't optimally managed, but the debt was so high, it didn't matter what was happening at an operating level.
What
So
was the
3 years
debt
later,
around? Just curious.
like 500, let me think. It was probably at least 700 million by the end of '87. Actually, probably, that's a good question. Probably more, might have been north of a billion, come to think of it. The numbers all get so big,
It's a
but
lot. Yeah.
it was basically unsustainable. And then by the end of 1990, Australia got in a big recession, and newspapers are very cyclical, and so we had to file for bankruptcy. So pretty much as soon as I started the takeover, it was doomed to fail. And
Mm.
so, you ask yourself, I had a Harvard MBA. I launched the takeover a few months after I graduated. It wasn't like it was that far away from my classes.
Right.
How could I have made so cataclysmic assumptions? And there are always reasons, but yeah, it's pretty amazing that I did what I did, given failure was, I wouldn't say guaranteed, but pretty close.
Yeah.
Not too many people make business decisions going into it when a rational person would say your chance of success is, I don't know, 1%, 5%.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
most intelligent people then say, I don't think I want to go ahead with that decision.
Yeah, exactly.
But
And
I
like
did.
sorry, go ahead. I went to graduate school too, and what they prepared me for graduate school was nothing compared to the real world, you know. And I
Right.
didn't go to Harvard, but I could imagine, just any student coming out of school, you think you're really prepared until the real world hits. And then also, I was an early entrepreneur in the 2008 recession, and I lost a business as well. And sometimes economic factors just play such a massive role that it doesn't matter who's
Right.
in charge, right? And there's a lot of debt there. There's a lot of just moving pieces. Family wasn't happy. Investors weren't happy, and so takes a big toll on somebody. But on top of that, your dad had passed away just the year before, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that important for listeners to understand is it doesn't matter how smart you are, sometimes, often emotional factors will impede your judgment.
Yeah.
And that's probably what's one of the leading causes of business failure, probably the economy and market shifts. But up there is emotional factors that cloud good judgment and stop you listening to people you need to listen to. So in my case, some of the backdrop for why I made such a cataclysmically terrible decision was in 1961. Some other members of my family, after my ugly divorce from my dad's second marriage to my mother, the third marriage, he said, well, we need you to take a bit of a break from being chairman for a few months while all the dust settles, which, he didn't really appreciate. And then in '76, 16 or so years later, other members of my family removed him as chairman. He was 74 and great health, mental acuity was very high. And he felt like just stabbed in the back. I was,
Mm.
probably about 15 at the time. So did that have some subliminal, subconscious influence in me? Probably, not consciously, but it's like,
Hmm.
why should I subconsciously care about these other members of my family when they stabbed my dad in the back?
Yeah.
Once they tried to, second time they succeeded. So that and my dad dies, and gosh, I want to preserve his legacy. And so it was sort of a point where I was sort of hell bent on doing this, and I wasn't really listening to what I should have listened to. Here's another good example, which will give listeners some pause. In first part of '87, I consulted some top merchant bankers, which U.S. equivalent of investment bankers, the blue chip, the best of the best, the equivalent of like a Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, people you do when you're about to make a big takeover.
Right.
And they looked at it all and they said, you know what, Warwick, the numbers don't add up. It does not make sense. If and when there is a hostile takeover, then rally the family, and that's a better play. Being young, naive, I felt like, well, that's not what I want to hear. They're not taking me seriously. I'm just this young 26-year-old, so that's not what I want to hear. And so then, this is the era of corporate takeovers. I went with advisors who had been advisors to some of the most successful corporate raiders in the country. They were quote unquote successful, but their ethics and their way of doing business is a bit different than the blue chip merchant bankers,
Right.
And so they said, oh, can we do it? Yeah. Now, can we do it and make it sustainable will be another question, but can we make it quote unquote succeed and we'll get paid? And so, it's not so much that what they do is wrong, but I don't think that was a particularly good fit for what I needed.
Yeah.
That was just a poor decision to ignore the blue chip merchant bankers and go with the corporate raiders takeover advisors. It's just very different,
Right.
I don't say you get what you pay for, but it's like, I was just so many bad decisions, but really the core of the why is because my emotions clouded my judgment. I was not thinking straight, and making an assumption that other family members would stay locked into a privatized company run by a 26-year-old. No rational person would do that.
Right.
But I made the assumption that they would.
Yeah.
They can keep their titles. I'll work in the marketing department, and I just want to see it be well run. It was just hopelessly and tragically naive. So a lot of lessons there in terms of what not to do and takeovers.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And I think a lot of people don't really understand the dynamic of family involved in a business, especially the bigger that it gets. There's a movie that just came out recently, Gucci. Have you seen it?
I've heard of it. I've seen the trailers.
Okay.
Yeah, and obviously people talk about Succession, which I haven't seen because, I don't know, it's probably too close to real life for me to be able to handle.
Fair. So if anybody wants to understand that dynamic more, I recommend seeing that movie. And Lady Gaga is actually the main character. And in the movie, in Gucci's history is, I don't know when they started, probably over 100 years as well. Started Gucci clothing line, fashion, became a billion-dollar giant. The family environment and the Gucci family was so toxic and so vengeful over one another, and many people were just in it for getting whatever they could get out of it, and it wasn't about putting the right leadership in roles or about really building the company. It was about who had the power, and at the end, all the Gucci family members got pushed out by outsiders that came in, and corporate people that came in and eventually said, you guys are just like, we don't want you around anymore. And it's hard, like, when your family comes after you and when your family disagrees with you and when they have their self-interest above the success of the company, or your own health, your own mental health and all of it. Like, it's a lot. I couldn't imagine doing that as a 26-year-old. And then bouncing back after that, which is what, we'll get into, but that was incredible that you did.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very interesting analogy. I mean, most family businesses, whether they be big or small, have challenges. And in our case, it wasn't so much that, there was a bunch of bad people and other factions. It was a bit more nuanced than that, but there was friction between different family members going back decades. And there are reasons, but there tends to be, it's hard to have a climate of openness and trust in family businesses. So, I certainly didn't feel that, quote unquote, a safe space where at a young age, I could say, look, I know you threw my dad out as chairman in 76, but what's your truth? What's your part of the story?
Mm-hmm.
I felt like, well, I know what the truth is. I don't need to ask them. What they do is horrifically wrong.
Right.
What's there to know?
Right.
Yeah, countries feel like they know the truth. The other country is the enemy.
Mm-hmm. Political
it's
parties.
Just an age-old.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. If you're an R or D, you're the enemy, and I don't need to know you you're evil and all that kind of deal. It's a common parable, and it was the same. So it's just when there's power and money, people jockeying for position, who's going to be the heir, and who's going to inherit what from whom. I mean, power and money, it does tend to erode character and the soul, irrespective of the humans involved. Mm-hmm. It does tend to do that. And there aren't too many family businesses that don't deal with that. Mistrust, fear, jockeying for position. And yes, in some cases, and maybe other families, it's all about the cars and the nice houses and, oh, let me have the bigger jet and the house in Monte Carlo. And,
right.
It's never enough. Whatever you have, you always want the next level, which
right.
is a whole nother story. No matter how successful you are, there's typically always somebody that's more successful. And believe it or not, wealthy people are envious of the people who are even more wealthy.
Yeah.
And more powerful. Very rarely will you be at the top and saying, I am the wealthiest person on the planet. I have the biggest house on the planet, the biggest jet, the most Ferraris.
Yeah.
I don't know who that person is, but there aren't too many of those.
well, there is no top. It's a facade, right? And then if you are there, a lot of people say it's very lonely because they don't have very many people they can trust or relate to. And so they have so much pressure at the top. It's like kings and queens and presidents, like presidents understand one another more than, people of their same party because they had the same job together.
Exactly. And you're highlighting a very important theme, Chris, is that certainly I've found for those who haven't had a whole lot of money or material success, it may be difficult to understand, but I'm not against success, but success, power, and status in of itself doesn't satisfy. I mean, growing up in the Fairfax family in Sydney, Australia, we had as much money, success, power, and status as you could want. Not only did we have money, we were respected. Mm-hmm. Now, most wealthy people, they want the power and the money, but they want respect too. Sometimes they do it through philanthropies, hopefully for good reason. Sometimes maybe not. Mm-hmm. We had all of that: respect, status, power. But yeah, it doesn't make you happy. Right. It just tends not to. And so, to me, what I found is success is fine, but significance, which we define at Crucible Leadership, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others, some altruistic goal. That's what truly satisfies. If you can have a business in which you're feeling like you're making a difference in other people's lives, you can actually get to the point where you can be successful and enjoy your life and maybe not feel quite so guilty,
Yeah.
So that's really key. But if it's all about some narcissistic, it's all about me, humans aren't wired to be fulfilled and happy as narcissists. You might not like the way humans are wired, but every human being has this innate characteristic, this desire that they will be happy if they serve others in some fashion. So if you want to be a narcissist, go right ahead, but guaranteed you will not be happy or fulfilled.
Yeah.
And you'll realize that one day, probably on your deathbed, but at that point it's too late.
Right, exactly. Nobody wants on their tombstone, I was the richest man in the graveyard. They said they want, like, I made a difference. That's what people want when they die.
Right. My kids love me, my wife, my husband, friends, co-workers. Mm-hmm. I made a difference. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's a key lesson I've certainly learned growing up the way I did.
So it was about a 3-year process from when you took over Fairfax to when then it was pretty much gone. Could you take us through some of the emotions that you went through that process?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as the company was taken over, or we took it over, I felt a bit like a deer in the headlights. We were in refinancing meetings constantly. I mean, there was a time in which we met with some investment bankers in New York, went back to Australia, and like a day later, no joke, I got on the plane to go back to New York. It's like a 20-plus hour
Just flight.
flight.
Yeah.
It's not quick. And so I brought in new management, which, as I mentioned, they did a good job, but I was so out of my element, so didn't want to be there, that I did everything you shouldn't do. Did I, manage by walking around encouraging journalists and other staff? No, I never went there because I felt so uncomfortable. When I'd go in the elevator in the morning, I just wanted to get out of there. I just felt like I don't want to be here. But you see, I was one of the other big lessons. I was living somebody else's life, not even my dad, probably the founder. I'm a reflective advisor. I like writing and, blogs and other things we do at Crucible Leadership, but running a large business, being in the limelight, that's not me. But it was too late at that point. And so those 3 years were painful. There's numerous refinancings. But it got more painful when the company went under. The day it went under in December 1990, we had 3 TV networks on our door. I was married by then. I met an American girl in Australia, and that's one of the reasons we've lived in the US for 30 plus years is A, I could, because I was married to an American, and B, I was happy to get out of Australia. It felt like escaping from a gilded prison. Australia's a wonderful place, but not for me,
Right.
certainly back then. But when the company went under, to have the equivalent of ABC, NBC, CBS on your doorstep,
Right.
TV cameras, and, it was national news. So the years after was just so, so difficult. In the 90s were difficult years. I felt like I let my parents down, my ancestors. I caused friction within the family. Yes, they sold out and probably got hundreds of millions of each major block, but still, that wasn't their choice, I think, from their perspective. They felt forced to. You had 4,000 and plus employees feeling like, what's going to happen now? We felt safe with the Fairfax family owning us because they're going to run it with integrity. Who's going to own us now?
Right.
Now, yes, life went on. Somebody bought it, but still to this day, you have people saying, life would have been better, would have been different if we had the protection, if you will, of the Fairfax family.
Right.
And, newspapers have been hit by digital, and there's other economic and market factors that I don't know that we could have helped with, but that's another story. But yeah, the feeling like I let my family down. And in some sense, I'm a person of faith, and the founder was a person of very strong Christian faith. So in my naivety, I felt like, gosh, God must have a plan somehow for me to be there. There's some divine universal plan. And I blew that one. That was soul crushing. Obviously, if some universal creator wanted it to happen, it would have happened from my perspective. But yeah, this sense of I hurt people, I made so many mistakes. It took years to recover from that. My self-esteem was just destroyed after that. I mean, I kept saying to myself, I have a Harvard MBA. How could I have been so dumb? How could I have been so dumb? Still to this day, it's hard for me to fathom. I mean, I get intellectually, I still think, gosh, why did I ignore that good advice? I mean, this wasn't me, but I don't know. So yes, the aftermath was very difficult to come back from that. Extremely difficult.
When do you think you said you got, I don't want to say fully recovered, but kind of got back to your new normal? How long did it take?
Well, it took years. I mean, I think some of the path back was, from my perspective, realized despite my naivety and poor assumptions, if God had wanted it to happen, it would have. The creator, whoever you see him to be, doesn't need our stuff. We're loved just because of who we are. Having a wife that loved me for who I was, she didn't need millions or billions. We weren't out on the street. We were okay. Having a young family, they just knew me as dad. I have 2 sons and a daughter. And then I began to find meaningful work that I could do. First at like an aviation services company doing some business and financial analysis. This was just pre-internet, so they didn't really know who I was. You couldn't really Google me, and I certainly didn't advertise it. But gradually, I began. That was a step. Hey, I got good performance reviews. I'm analytical. Back in the day, I could do Excel pretty well. Then from there, I got into executive coaching, certified in National Coach Federation executive coach. Gosh, I seem to be good at asking questions and helping leaders think through things. And there was step by step that I began. I got on 2 nonprofit boards, an elder at a non-denominational church, a private school board, back then. So little bit by little bit, it was almost like drops of grace. There were things that I can do, like breadcrumbs that showed I can actually be a good reflective advisor. I have a perspective on leadership, but more from an advisory perspective rather than a CEO. So I began to get a better picture of who I was and how I could contribute to the world. So, but it wasn't some big Mount Olympus vision. It was, drop of grace by drop of grace. I began to see who I was as I began to do things in which I could help my other people, but also do well. It also began to heal my soul in a sense, not overnight, but bit by bit. That was probably the key path back, is finding things I could do and realizing who I was. And it was okay to be me. Yeah. Not everybody has to be Rupert Murdoch or some big, media conglomerate person. And it's okay. It's okay to be you.
Yeah. And you moved to America not too long after that, and then started, what was just a regular 9-to-5 job, right? What were you doing when you got to America?
Yeah. So that first regular job was, in Maryland, where I live, working at a local aviation services company doing business and financial analysis. And so that was the first regular job. And kind of dumbed down my resume, which didn't seem ethically. It didn't, because I couldn't get a job as like an ex-media mogul, so somehow it didn't bother me. But as I said, pre-internet, they couldn't really Google me. I mean, you don't really Google people. Right. I guess you look them up on social media these days, but that didn't exist back then, fortunately. Yeah. So that was the first regular job, which I was very gratified to have something I could do and do, pretty well.
That's good. Yeah, I was interested in knowing how you felt about going for, back to like a 9-to-5 job as opposed to leaving the position you were. If it was relieving for you and much more even fulfilling and relaxing, or just something to get by at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not somebody that, I don't care about titles and power or even money. The one thing that did give me pause, I remember thinking, I've got to be the lowest paid Harvard Business School graduate in history, because this wasn't like some high flying job. And it's not about the money, but as a measure of my, success, when, maybe some of my folks I went to business school with, I remember reading one time, one guy that I knew from business school was like CEO of Continental Airlines, which is a few airline mergers ago. It's like, okay, good for him, but I guess that's not me, is it?
That's not Greg. Is that Greg Brenneman? Is that?
No, it's not. It's
he was on the podcast about a year ago.
No.
He's CEO
no, this
of Continental.
No. This is somebody else. Maybe before him, but but no, it was more. But I didn't mind being in a cubicle per se. It just I was happy for the work, and eventually I moved on to coaching, because I felt like, again, I'm a person of faith. God, whoever up there is like, Warwick, you're playing small. You're not using all the gifts and abilities you have. Yeah, you could do financial analysis, but there are other things that you can be using. So playing small, it's not about arrogance. It's using all you have, for others and help the world be a better place. So that was sort of a key pivot for me, moving on from there to doing executive coaching. So that was a small, big step, really, in a lot of ways.
How long did it take you to go from leaving Fairfax to coming to America to then starting your own business, your own venture again?
Yeah, it's probably the most key point was in 2008, when the pastor of my church, again, non-denominational church, like about 2000 odd, pre-pandemic, said, we'd like you to give a sermon illustration. And I said, that's fine. I'm not, certainly back then, Mr. Public Speaker, but I, gave my story. And since the church, I felt like some lessons I felt like God had taught me. And what amazed me in the weeks and months after, people would come up to me and say, Warwick, what you shared really helped me. And I'm thinking, how many ex-media moguls are there in the congregation? Like none. How could anybody relate to my story? It's one thing if you say, gee, I'm a cancer survivor, or
Right.
Physical challenges. There are other people, sadly, that can relate to this. But somehow by being authentic and vulnerable, people felt like they got some, it helped them. And so at that point, having resisted for years the idea to write about my story because it was so painful. Why would I want to relive something that's so painful? And I've never been one to write about, oh, I was right, they were wrong. That's self-serving and typically wrong.
Yeah.
But if I could write a book in a lessons learned format to help people, so then it took me years to write, because imagine writing about your most painful moments.
Yeah.
After 2 hours a day, I'd be like, I'm done. I
Yeah.
cannot write anymore. But that was really the driver. I wrote the book initially thinking it was straight to get it published, but some publishers wanted more of a sensational thing, and I wasn't going to diss on other family members. So one publisher said, we might be interested at some point, but you need to create a brand. I'm thinking, okay, I have a Harvard MBA, I get the concept. So back in about 2016, I began with a great team in Denver, Signal, created a branding and marketing plan. And then from there, blogs, social media, our own podcast, Beyond the Crucible. My book was published October 2021. I've begun speaking. So it all grew out of the book. Mm-hmm. And then, like a lot of visions, you don't have this massive 20-year vision. It's like, I want to publish a book. Oh, I need to have an audience that's going to buy the book. Got it. Okay, so we better do social media and branding and podcasting. And it all grew out of that talk in church in 2008. Basically, if my story can help people, it is worth the pain of writing. So my whole motivation for what I do is not about money and dollars and cents. Money still doesn't motivate me. I'm not against it. We have a very comfortable lifestyle, more comfortable than most. But it's all about helping people. That's what motivates me to take the new step. And each year, okay, what are we going to do this year? How are we going to move the ball forward? How are we going to deepen the message with folks? How are we going to reach more folks? It's all about helping people. That is my driving motivation, if you will, for what I do with Crucible Leadership. But it all started with that talk in church in 2008.
That's incredible. Yeah, it's our darkest moments are given to us so we can overcome them and then help others get out of their darkest moments, right? And while they suck going through and even recovering from, there's a reason for it. There's a reason why we go through all those. And I remind myself that consistently anytime I'm having a hard time or I'm a little, down on myself or depressed or things aren't going my way. And I'm just like, this is all for some reason so I can inspire others. I lost my first business in 2008 after the recession, and I was eating a can of corn and green beans for lunch, and then I would have cereal with water in it for breakfast. And I was 26, 27, so near the age you were when you took over Fairfax. I remember the naiveness, but I was still like, I'm not going to give up. This experience is going to help other people someday. And it was one of the things that just I remember that moment kept me going through all the years, and still here as an entrepreneur going today.
Well, it's so true. I mean, one of the things, and I feel like, I'm sure like you, I keep learning. I mean, on our own podcast, Beyond the Crucible, we had a series in which we were resilience late last year. We were interviewing a number of people. And I remember there was an Australian woman we were talking to, and she became diagnosed as a quadriplegic when at age 12, when she dove into an above ground pool. Above ground pools are typically not that deep. Mm-hmm. And her parents told her, "Hey, Stacy, don't do it. Don't dive into the pool. When you're a 12-year-old, you just think you're bulletproof and ignore your parents' advice. That's normal operating procedure." And so she had to go through years that this was all my fault. But now she speaks and she consults. She just has this happy, vibrant personality. And she said to me, what I went through was a gift. Now, how could being diagnosed as a quadriplegic be a gift? And I've heard more than one person say that. But it's not so much she's happy that what happened to her, but it was more she wouldn't be the person she is without that. I imagine for you too, you wouldn't be the person you are now without that, challenge back in 2008. So I never thought of what I went through as a gift or a blessing, but in recent months, I've begun to see, it does feel true, because I wouldn't be who I am now without that. So,
Yeah.
hard times can be a blessing. There's no way you're going to see that at the time. I'm not here to say, oh, becoming a paraplegic is a blessing. I mean, there's
Right.
just no way that that's true. But I don't know. That just floored me when Stacey Kopass, is her name, said that. It's like, I'm sorry, what? What you went through is a blessing?
Yeah.
That makes no sense to me. I've heard of psychological reframing, but this is ridiculous. But
Yeah.
I think I get where she's coming from.
Yeah. Um, I yeah, I completely agree. That's what you guys talk about that a lot on your podcast, right? You talk about people's darkest moments and then transforming and becoming stronger individuals and helping people. Is it all the guests that come on your show, or that are people that have gone through things like that?
Yeah, I'd say we have two kinds of guests. One kind of guest is the pure crucible. And basically what we say is your worst day doesn't define you. You can bounce back. It's funny, I wrote a short social media post a couple of days ago because, like a lot of folks, we all watch the Olympics, and listeners probably remember Lindsay Jacob Ellis, the snowboard cross, snowboarder in 2006 in the Turin game. She was in the lead by a ways. She goes over the last jump and does this hot dog celebratory deal, and she falls and comes in second. If she just made the jump and didn't do anything stupid, she would have won. Well, Olympics after Olympics, she kept coming back and not making it. Finally, at age 36, she's here at the games in Beijing in 2022, and she wins. She doesn't see it as redemption, but she said, I wouldn't have stuck with the sport of cross snowboarding these many years, but I was driven to try and improve the sport. She's a hero to a lot of young women who want to go in that sport. But, for years, everybody said to her, so Lindsay, why did you do that stupid move?
Right.
Year after year after year. I mean, that was really stupid, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And what do you say to that year after year? But, it's, how do you not let that define you? So that's a recent example, but we have a lot of guests in which, the darkest day doesn't define them. They bounce back, they forgive themselves, they forgive others, they use their pain for a purpose. We've had folks of every gender, race, tragedy you can think of, and the path back is pretty much identical for everybody. And it's not letting your worst day define you. Using your pain to serve others, forgiveness of yourself and others. Find your calling, understand how you're wired. The path back is the same. And I just find that so affirming to tell people stories and to learn from them.
Yeah.
It's incredibly motivating to me.
I was thinking of you before the show because along the topic that you were just mentioning, one of the more impactful books in my life is The Lone Survivor, which is also a movie. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's the story of Marcus Luttrell, who was a Navy SEAL, went into Afghanistan with his team, lost I think 16 Navy SEALs. He went in with 4 people. All of them died except him. And then he was terrorized by the Taliban for 5 days until other special forces can come in and finally get him out. And he came out when he was in his late 20s, incredibly traumatized, almost died, shot a few times. And then, he started the long journey of rehabilitating himself and then also separating himself from what everybody knows him as. And he was saying, the hardest part about all of this is not only I lost all my best friends, but now everybody wants to talk to me all the time about the worst day of my life. And I was like,
Nice.
or the worst moment in his life. And I was like, oh, wow. And I thought about you, and I was I'm curious to know more about your process of handling, because I think it could help other people. So many people throughout the past 30 years or so have probably wanted to talk to you about one of the hardest times of your life, right? And for those people that are either defined by a moment that was one of the worst moments of their life, or have society has branded them as, like, take a Britney Spears or Justin Bieber or Miley Cyrus, how do you pull through that, or what's your advice to people to, like, pull through that to regain, not only their composure, but their path in life, their own self-confidence, but also separating themselves from that experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. I mean, I think for me, one of the keys is identity. So I could see growing up, I was a Fairfax, which meant a lot in Australia and certainly in Sydney, and family business. If my identity was in family business and Fairfax and what that meant, I would be in trouble. But at least I can only speak for my journey. I believe everybody should have an anchor, whatever their beliefs and values. It could be a major religion, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. It could be a philosophy. Most people today are spiritual, maybe not religious. Whatever your beliefs are, it doesn't matter to others. It's not so much what other people think. It should be, what are yours? So for me, it was my anchor in my Christian faith, that God loves me just because of who I am. I've always believed that, but it took a while to actually actively believe it in my soul. So that's sort of a key part of being able to get over that worst day. And as I mentioned, when you're using your pain to help others, in some sense, it does make it worthwhile. It's not an overnight, hey, I'm good. I talk about a healing balm, drops of grace. So, for instance, as I have begun speaking with the book release late last year to business groups and universities, the young people often resonate with it, because I was 26 at the time. And people say, boy, that story was helpful, and thank you so much. And by the nature of their questions, I can see they get it. Like one student, we were at Seton Hall in northern New Jersey at one point, and one student afterwards said, so Warwick, how easy is it for you to go back to Australia? That's a great question, because it's not that easy. Because I'm reminded of the scene of the crime and my own mistakes and the money that tends to, hurt people within families. So I think just having your identity rooted in not what you do or who you are, your name, or who your friends say, or maybe you're a basketball star in high school and, you've got a few more pounds since, and, that shining day is gone and will never return. Decades have gone past. Don't have your identity in who you were or what you do or how much money, but have it in something more eternal, whatever that means for you. And as you begin to find that you can use your pain to help others, it's not as painful to me to talk about that worst day, because I'm talking about it like here on this podcast, on the business method. I'm talking about it not to wallow in it, but to help people. That's the whole point, is to give people hope. And so I don't mind talking about it. I'm not bulletproof. I mean, I had editorial cartoons done of me back in my newspaper days. My least favorite one was, how do you start a small business? Give Warwick Fairfax a big one. I mean, some of these are kind of brutal. And once in a while, they'll write stuff in Australia like they did a number of months ago. Hey, Warwick's coming out with a book, and he'll tell you what he went through and how he came through it for a price. Well, who sells their book for free? Right. I mean, come on, really? Yeah. It's not like it costs $1,000. It's like it's just normal book price. It's like, I mean, really? I mean, it didn't devastate me, but it annoyed me. It kind of hurt me at some point, a little bit maybe. But so I'm not bulletproof. Yeah. I mind that kind of story, Yeah. But all in all, it's a lot easier for me to talk about my worst day. Because I know my identity is not in being a media mogul or Fairfax family person. For me, it's being a child of God. And secondly, I'm using what I went through to help people. So that to me is the key of getting through your worst day. It doesn't define you. You have a whole life. Forgive yourself, forgive others. Those are all the key components for me, and frankly, for all of the 100+ guests we've had, of how you get back from your worst day. And it's always going to be a scar, depending on what it is. Maybe it's difficult to talk about all the details, but it's a lot easier than it used to be. It really is. The more you do it for the right purpose, it does get easier.
Yeah. That's good. That's amazing. Um, I also on top, well, there's something to say about, when you do have a spiritual grounding. I'm a regular meditator, and it does really help you go through those hard times, because there's something bigger than yourself. And have you read the book Sapiens? Have you ever heard of the
I
book?
haven't.
No, it's a really good book. Anyway, it's really about the history of mankind, dumbed down into like a 400-page book or 500-page book or something like that. And he talks about like what humanity has really evolved, but the reason why we've become unified the way that we have, has always been of an idea of like a higher power, right? If it was just like self-interest or one leader or even wealth that people were seeking or trying to bond together, it would always end in some type of disaster. But the reason why we evolved and continually unified into becoming better humans and closer humans and less warlike, even though we're still in a lot of wars. But it's always been like the idea of a higher power that has been able to keep us evolving and growing, right? And when you go through, if you do anything significant with your life, even if you just like live a regular life or average Joe life, having some spiritual type of foundation will almost always help you through those difficult times. And especially like for me, like reflecting and revisiting that experience until the pain is gone away, or relieved significantly, which really helps as well. And as opposed to ignoring it and just letting it stay buried down inside of you.
Absolutely. I think, for many, and, some may use meditation, yoga, other spiritual practices. It's important to have a set of tools that you use. So I get angry, frustrated, sad, depressed. I mean, just like everybody else. And when that happens, for me, as a person of faith, I love scripture memory. Maybe it's 1 Peter 5:7, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Proverbs 3:5 and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll make your path straight. I mean, whatever it is, that might be mantras from different religious, philosophical perspectives, books, but whatever kind of centers your soul. I'm a person that prays. I also believe in, life is a village. So if it's personal, I'll talk to my wife. Gee, I'm angry and frustrated about something. I'm not sure what it is. We'll talk it through. And yeah, I'm afraid about this, that, and the other. It's because of my past. It's like, okay, well, that's your past. That's not who you are now. And okay, that's right. If it's business, some people on my team, but if I'm feeling bad about something, I'm not just going to sit there. I'm going to do something. And it starts with, for me, prayer, maybe scripture, maybe it's meditation from a spiritual sense. It's talking with people, getting myself centered, and it does work. It's like, I don't wait for that little ember to become a forest fire. I deal with it immediately. And that's what I think everybody should. Whatever your spiritual practices are, and to me, it often includes other people, because other people can help us. People who really know us, we feel safe with. I think we should all have at least one person we feel like we can talk to and talk about anything with. If you don't, you need to find that person. Be it wife, husband, brother, sister, mom, dad, friend, somebody.
Yeah.
But, it's, you don't wallow in anger and bitterness, and it's only get worse. You got to deal with it. Deal with it as soon as possible.
Absolutely.
And then you'll be able to make better business decisions too. Worse, as I can testify, bad business decisions happen. And you got a swirl of anger, bitterness, and emotion rolling around. So if nothing else, be practical. If you want to be successful in business, deal with that emotional stuff, because then maybe you'll actually listen and make good decisions. So it's extremely practical dealing with the emotional stuff.
Tell us what's going on with Crucible leadership. Tell us what you guys are doing there, and all the details.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So Crucible Leadership, if you want to find out kind of more about me, it's crucibleleadership.com. As I mentioned, we've got a podcast, Beyond the Crucible, where a lot of times we interview people about their worst day and how they came back, but we also interview what we call perspective guests who have a perspective on, how you bounce back from challenges to lead a life of significance. I'm active on Facebook and LinkedIn, have a blog, and have begun to speak to all sorts of people, college age as well as business groups, about my story. And we're looking at 2022. What are some other things that we can do, whether it's, I don't know, e-courses, or there's all sorts of things we're thinking of, just to try to deepen the message with folks. But for me, I'm not driven by money or financial goals. It's how can we broaden and deepen the message to help people. And unfortunately, in the business world, very few people seem to want to talk about failure. And so I'd love if what I did felt less unique. Maybe it's good from a marketing positioning perspective, blue ocean strategy, to quote Renee Malborn. And hey, it doesn't seem like a lot of people are doing this, talking about, gee, I was an idiot. And, it's not so much a marketing strategy, it's just kind of what I do. But yeah, I mean, it's, I find it very fulfilling. And I just wish more business folks were willing to talk about it. Early on, I did a podcast at the Harvard Business School alumni group, and one of the heads of it just asked one of my team, almost whispering, is Warwick willing to talk about failure? Basically, why did he say that? Because your typical Harvard MBA does not want to talk about failure.
Right.
Well, that's the whole point of what I do. So, if you're a business person out there, I mean, Chris has mentioned, you've had some challenges. Most entrepreneurs will fail. They'll fail multiple times before they succeed. It doesn't mean you're a failure just because you failed. So don't be embarrassed about it. It's not who you are. So be willing. If you're not willing to talk about failure, how in the world are you going to learn from it and move on? So, don't bury it. Talk about it. It's really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, that's fantastic. I've thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you today, Warwick, and thank you so much for being open to share your story with us about one of the most difficult times in your life, and how you overcame it, and then what you're doing now. And so, and I really liked that you got into the juicy details about like getting over it and then pulling yourself out and making it something about helping others. And so I do appreciate that. Is there any final words of wisdom you'd like to drop off for our listeners before we wrap up?
Well, thanks again, Chris, for having me. And I'd say for those listeners, if today's your worst day, maybe you've lost a business, maybe something terrible has happened to you, your worst day doesn't have to define you. There is hope. You can live a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others. But no, it's not going to be easy, and it could take a long time to come back. But just think of what's one positive step I can make today. Maybe it's talk to a friend, talk to a loved one, begin to dream about how what I went through can help people. But, your worst day doesn't have to define you. Think of, what's one small, it could be a micro baby step. What's one small step I can do today? And I know it sounds trite, but enough of those small steps does add up to a lot of progress as you look back. But it just, you got to have the courage to take what's one small step, no matter how small I can take today.
Yeah, that's well put, my friend. If the listeners want to reach out and learn more about what you have going on, crucibleleadership.com, is that the best place?
Absolutely. And again, active on Facebook under Crucible Leadership, and active on LinkedIn under Warwick Fairfax. Warwick with the silent W there in the middle. But it's more, so anyway, that's some ways you can get a hold of me.
Podcast Beyond the Crucible on all the platforms?
Exactly right.
Okay.
Exactly right.
Very good. Warwick, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all of your tips and tricks and experience with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it.
And listeners, we're going to stop there. Thank you guys for tuning in once again, and we'll see you on the next episode. Goodbye, everybody.